Morning, folks. If you were to take a glance at the newspaper, perhaps listen to the evening news, even log on to your favourite news site, often lamented these days is the fact of a lack of leadership from politicians and political parties. Indeed, the Sydney Morning Herald ran this story just last September, blaming a lack of leadership on the political and economic condition of our country. Now, that same article there quoted the former American President Jimmy Carter, who back in 1979 drew attention to the same condition in America when he said, there is a crisis of confidence that struck at the very heart and soul of the national will. Now, we see and we experience this everywhere. A lack of leadership that eventually leads to a crisis. We see it in politics, we see it in industry where a company will lose its competitive edge, and unfortunately we see it in the church and in Christian organisations. So how would one then define what leadership is? A very early American president, John Quincy Adams, said, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, to learn more, to do more and to become more, then you are a leader." Eisenhower, the general from World War II, said the supreme quality of leadership is unquestionable integrity. A secular writer, management consultant by the name of Peter Drucker, said that management is doing things right while leadership is doing the right thing. And the preacher John Maxwell said leadership is influence. Now, book after book has been written on leadership, from Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking and J. Oswald Sanders' Spiritual Leadership. But there is a very old book that was written in the 5th century BC by a Jew who will become one of that nation's most significant leaders, carrying out a task that forced him to deal with a number of very difficult situations. The book bears his name, and of course it is the book of Nehemiah. And we're hoping that by the end of this series of messages that we will have come to appreciate all that he was able to accomplish as God used him and developed his character with qualities that perhaps we can also learn from ourselves. Because these are the things that served him well as a leader of the people. Now, we do need to consider a little bit of history to understand what has been happening to the nation of Israel and where Nehemiah has come from and what he's trying to accomplish. And so we'll step back in time a little bit to the time of the kings, King Saul, King David, King Solomon. This was a time when the nation of Israel held a place of great importance on the world stage. But under Solomon, the nation began to fall apart to the extent that the kingdom became divided. 10 of the original 12 tribes were centred in Samaria, 2 of them around Jerusalem, Israel in the north, and Judah in the south. Now, both of these nations eventually collapsed as their behaviour degenerated following their complete disregard for the laws of God. Israel was first when the Assyrians invaded them and took them into captivity in about 722 BC. The southern kingdom held on a little bit longer until 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar, the then king of Babylon, invaded once again, and the city of Jerusalem was totally destroyed. The survivors were taken into captivity. They walked about 1,000 kilometres or so to what would be their new home in Babylon. And this is recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Nebuchadnezzar carried to Babylon all of the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all of the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. Now, during this time, God never forgot his people, though I'm sure that the Jewish remnant thought that perhaps God had forgotten about them. However, this was the time of the prophets like Jeremiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zechariah, Malachi, and Daniel. And you might remember the story in Daniel of the handwriting on the wall, and that foreshadowed the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of the Medes and the Persians. And that happened in about 539 BC when a king named Cyrus, he takes over, he's in control. And so in carrying on reading in 2 Chronicles 36 from verse 22, the story continues. It says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it into writing. Now, this is what it said. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. And so God is about to use Cyrus to begin sending the Jews back to Jerusalem. Now they do this under the leadership of three different men. The first group is led back by Zerubbabel. About 80 years later, another group is led back by Ezra. And it was during this time that Cyrus dies and King Artaxerxes, he's now in power. And so about 13 years after Ezra, Nehemiah comes on the scene and he leads the last group back to the city that is being rebuilt. Zerubbabel and Ezra had focused on rebuilding the temple. And when Nehemiah comes, he concentrates on rebuilding the walls that had been destroyed about 140 years earlier. And so the book of Nehemiah is all about this rebuilding process. Now, Nehemiah himself is a government official. He's the cupbearer to the king. And while that doesn't sound very impressive, it's a pretty important job because his job is to taste the wine and the food before the king eats, which was, of course, to prevent the king from being poisoned. And so he's literally laying his life on the line every day for the king. And so there was a pretty strong friendship that had been developed between these two fellows over time. Now, in a moment, we're going to start reading in chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah. So if you've got your Bible or your tablet, you might like to take that out. We'll have a look at that. But I just want to let you know that we put together a little handout, another one of this homework for you to read. On Nehemiah, there's a bit about the man, a bit about the book. There's an outline of the book. There's a little map outlining the temple area, taken into captivity in Babylon. There's a few other maps and charts. There's a timeline of events of how all of these things took place. And so if you're interested in that, they're in the tract rack, and feel free to take one of those when you leave later on today. So beginning in chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah, verse 1, it says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 12th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Our story then begins in the wintertime. Kislev is December. Artaxerxes has been on a throne in power for about 20 years. And Nehemiah's brother, Hanani, has just returned from Jerusalem with a really troubling report, saying that they are in great trouble and disgrace, meaning that these folk were having a hard time, a difficult time. And that was partly because the walls of the city were in total disrepair. And so they were in constant danger of attack from their enemies. Now, this concerns Nehemiah, and he gets quite emotional and he begins to weep. Even though he had been born in Babylon and had never been to Jerusalem, he felt for the people and he wants to help them. To do this, he needs a favour. And he thinks that maybe the king might be able to help him out. But before he rushes off to see the king, he spends a few days praying for guidance and asking God for a favourable response from Artaxerxes when he sees him. Now, those few days in prayer, they helped to settle his mind. I'm guessing they lowered his level of anxiety so that he could quite calmly consider the problems ahead. Of course, he also believed that God would help him. And so let's take a look at this prayer in the following verses to see if there's a few lessons or two that we could learn. And perhaps the first step I want us to see is Nehemiah's concern. Because if we want to pray specifically about something, it's probably going to be something that concerns us. And we see that in Nehemiah. Because he wants to know what's been happening in Jerusalem. And when he hears the news, it breaks his heart. His concern for the people grows, which causes him to pray, to ask for God's help. But it goes beyond just hearing the words. Verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Meaning that he took some time, not only to fast and to pray, but also to understand the need, understand what's going on. He wasn't about to rush into offering any sort of quick solution before he carefully considered the problems. Now, I can't speak for you, but my reaction would have probably been a lot different. I would have probably said, "What do you mean? The walls aren't finished yet? They've been back there for all of those years and nobody ever thought about rebuilding the wall? Somebody must have really messed up with that." That was probably not a good reaction on my part, but thankfully Nehemiah had more compassion and understanding than probably I will ever have. Instead, he takes time to understand the issue. And so perhaps a better response on my part, and maybe yours, is to go to God with the problem instead of thinking, how can I work this out? Nehemiah's next step then is to confess, verses 6 and 7. He says, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer. Your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws that you gave your servant Moses." And notice that while he confesses on behalf of the people, he also recognises his own part in this problem. He uses the word we. He uses the word I. We have acted wickedly. We have not obeyed the commands. And I include myself and my father's family in this. Now, it is one thing to be concerned and another to understand the problems, but it's another thing to confess that our problems often come about because of what we do. This is our fault. This isn't God's fault. God had promised that if they disobeyed his laws, they would be taken into captivity, and that is exactly what happened. Verse 8, Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations.' But God also promised that if they turned back to him, he would bring them back to Jerusalem. Verse 9. 'If you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to a place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name.'" Now God had done as he said in scattering them. And now Nehemiah is asking God to fulfill the second part of the promise. And that's a bold statement that he makes. God, we've done wrong. We confess that. But now, Lord, please, fulfill the second part of the promise and take us back to the city. Nehemiah's next step then is to commit himself to that task. And so in verse 11, he decides that he's going to ask Artaxerxes for some help. "Lord, let your ears be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favour in the presence of this man." I'm guessing that some of you are old enough to remember that old saying about the law of the Medes and the Persians. Ever heard that being said? And that was all about trying to change something and the difficulty of trying to change something. In fact, there's a veiled reference to that in Esther chapter 1 and verse 19. Anyway, these people here, they are those Medes and those Persians. And perhaps Artaxerxes is not known for readily changing his mind. And so Nehemiah realises that he has a difficult job ahead of him. He knew that he'd have to ask the king for some time off, and so he prays for success in what he believes God would have him do. And so prayer is the first major step we see in Nehemiah's life. The story now continues in chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, we read, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, and so the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?' This can be nothing but sadness of heart." Chapter 1 begins in the month of Kislev, which is, as we said, December. And now it's the month of Nisan, however you pronounce that, and that's April. So nothing has happened for 4 months. Nehemiah had said in the last verse of chapter 1, "Give your servant success today." But nothing has happened. For 120 days, nothing changed. Not even a glimmer of hope. And I guess that all of us have been there at some point. Perhaps you heard somebody say, "I just pray, give the situation to God." And so you do that, nothing happens. A week later, the situation is still the same. A month later, a year later, nothing is different. Now, in the case of Nehemiah here, I think it reflects his patience. Perhaps something we all need to learn, and evidently Nehemiah was learning that. Because during those 120 days, the king never guessed that anything was troubling Nehemiah. For 4 months, he had carried on regardless, saying in verse 1, "I had not been sad in his presence before." And so despite wondering, Nehemiah must have been confident that God was doing something. However, everyone has a point where it all just gets too much. And perhaps this was that day. Maybe he's wondering, is something ever going to happen? And that sadness must have been reflected on his face. So much so that Artaxerxes sensed that something was wrong, which concerned Nehemiah even more so because you don't want to upset the king. Verse 2, it says, I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me, what is it that you want? And this is exactly what Nehemiah had been waiting for. For years and years he had put his life on the line for the king. And so the king's response here is probably the result of their friendship. As the king says, what is it that you want? Verse 4. And then I prayed to the God of heaven. And this is Nehemiah's second recorded prayer. It's not long. Probably didn't even close his eyes. And I'm guessing that he prayed for wisdom. Verse 5. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favour in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. And then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked him, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? And it pleased the king to send me, and so I set a time. Two things to note here, just simple things. And the first is that while the king is happy to let Nehemiah go, he did want him to return. And so Nehemiah must have been a pretty conscientious sort of a worker. And then secondly, Nehemiah's response is pretty definite. It says, I set a time. And maybe this reflects the fact that while he's been praying, he's also been planning. He's also been preparing. You see, these 4 months of just waiting for the right time, he used that to prepare for the time when the right opportunity came along. And now it has. And so he is able to give the king a definite answer. Because it seems from this that Nehemiah has been doing some planning. Now, when we go on and read the text, you might think that he's a little bit bold, but maybe he's just being practical because he's thought about this. He's aware of some of the supplies that he's going to need. He knows that he'll need permission to travel through various countries. And so he says in verse 7 and 8, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Aspar, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence that I will occupy. Well, Artaxerxes agreed with this. He gives him permission, gives him the necessary documents, and also provides him with a cavalry escort. And so Nehemiah sees this as God's hand at work after his months of faithful prayer. Verse 8 and 9. Because of the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. And so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters, and the king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Well, Nehemiah finally then arrives in Jerusalem after probably a long journey. No doubt he's exhausted. He takes a few days off to rest, and then he begins his recce around the city. And in verses 13 through 16, it describes that trek that he took around the city walls. He soon realises that rebuilding those walls will be a pretty challenging sort of a job. I read that they were probably about 4 or 5 kilometres long, approximately a metre or so thick, and maybe 6 metres high. Some of the stone blocks were very massive, very large, and many had fallen into the valley below, and they'd have to be dragged back up onto the site. So this was not going to be easy. It would require a bunch of workers. It would also be dangerous because their enemies were not too keen on seeing this wall being rebuilt. He also needed the cooperation of the people, which might have been a little bit difficult because this had been tried under the time of Zerubbabel and Ezra, but it hadn't worked. And so you can just hear some of the people saying, well, we tried that once before and it didn't work. And so Nehemiah had to find a way to motivate the people. Perhaps they had simply just gotten used to the dilapidated state of the surroundings in which they were living. So look at verse 17 and 18 and to see what Nehemiah points out to the people. I said to them, you see the trouble that we are in? Once again, he wants them to know that they are in this together. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, this is the result of their neglect. But what it does is give the impression that God had forgotten about these people. And they needed to change that impression. They needed to make the community see what they were really all about. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. Again, he includes himself in this. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And so he reminds them of just how God had helped him and how he would help them as well. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. However, the residents of the city weren't his only concern, and verse 10 introduced us to his first brush with the opposition that he'll face. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and now in verse 9 he adds Geshem the Arab. And we'll hear a lot more about these fellas as we read through this book, but without question, anyone who tries to ever accomplish anything is going to face some opposition. I think you'd have to agree that we have to take our hats off to this fellow Nehemiah. In these couple of chapters, we've seen how that he recognised that it was only God that could ever change the heart of the king. And so he begins to pray, he waits, he's patient. But while he waits, he begins to plan. And despite the opposition, he begins to carry out that plan. And he inspires the people to join him in the great task that is ahead of them. As we close in just a moment, we'll do this a little bit different. I'm just going to ask us to spend just a few moments in quiet prayer by ourselves. Just a couple of minutes. I'm going to play a little bit of music just softly in the background. But you know, today we've seen Nehemiah was really, without a doubt, a man of prayer. I read in one commentary that I think there are 12 prayers of his that are included in this book. But this is a character trait that we need to grow or perhaps develop. And so just in these couple of minutes, I'd like us to take some time to just reflect quietly. You might like to pray for the church. You might like to pray for the leadership of the church here. Maybe it's somebody in your family, somebody in need that you'd like to pray for. Perhaps there's a situation in your life that needs a little rebuilding. Maybe you're feeling a little bit like Nehemiah, and you know that God will answer in His way and in His time. You're just hoping it would happen a little bit sooner. But whatever the need, I would invite you to pray, and then when the music is finished, we'll sing our little closing chorus together. Let's pray, shall we? Nehemiah was the great leader that we will learn about and learn from. Jesus is our leader. And so let's turn our eyes upon him. Just stay seated as we sing this through once, and then ask you to stand as we sing it a second time. We sing our best.
Now unto
Sing it to each other.
who is able to keep you from falling, and present you faultless before the presence of His glory with exceeding joy. To the only wise God, our Saviour,
Be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Thank you for worshipping with us today. I just remind you that refreshments will be served over there. And
now unto
Sing it to each other.
who is able to keep you from falling, and present you faultless before the presence of His glory with exceeding joy. To the only wise God, our Saviour,
be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Thank you for worshipping with us today. I just remind you that refreshments will be served over there. And